Salish Sea Butoh Festival Evening Lecture Series. I really wanted to launch this lecture series this year. We've never had it before in such a robust way, so that we could enrich ourselves, our fellow artistic colleagues, our community with history, philosophy, and cross-cultural studies, all of these important components of Butoh from the scholars and researchers that have dedicated so many decades of their life to researching Butoh and uncovering the archive and sharing it with the world. So thanks for supporting it, and I hope we can continue it in future years of the festival and eventually start bringing scholars from Japan and scholars from all over the world to share their lectures with us. So that's the grand vision that I have. So today is very special. I'm so excited, and I'm so excited to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Rosemary Candelario. Round of applause, please. Has been supporting Salish Sea Butoh Festival since its inception. She was one of our inaugural workshop teachers, and this year she is giving so much to the festival, teaching a workshop, directing a student performance, performing on the main stage, and giving us this academic lecture on Butoh Ecologies. So we're very grateful to her. She's an associate professor at the University of Texas in Austin in the Department of Theater and Dance. She's the co-editor of the Rutledge Companion to Butoh Performance with Bruce Baird, who was here with us. She has an amazing publication, if you haven't read it, from Wesleyan Press on Eco and Coma. So highly recommend that award-winning publication that she released in 2016. And now she's working on this multi-case, multi-dimensional study that she's gonna share with us today. So without further ado, Dr. Rosemary Candelario.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. And I'm gonna try to not be hidden behind all of technology here. Before I start, of course, so many thanks to Yvonne for bringing us all together and for cultivating a community that really values learning about history and Butoh philosophy along with movement. That's a real treat. I remember back at the first Salish Sea, it was me and Joan and Julie teaching, and Yvonne then scheduled like a roundtable discussion, and we were all kind of, what are you going to talk about? Is anybody going to want to come? And we had the most in-depth, exciting conversation. Some of you were there at that conversation. So I think that's a real testament to Yvonne and to you all and to our Butoh community that we are both curious with our bodies and our minds and our body-minds together. So, and I also, before I start, I want to just give a huge thanks to An-Magrith Erlandsen, who originally commissioned this talk a few years ago for her incredible series, Praxis and Revelta. That's a hard word for me to say. You had speakers, workshops, all kinds of things, all online, sort of tail end of the pandemic. So it's very much thanks to Ahimya that I first brought these ideas together. This is a book project that's still in process, got a little bit delayed by the pandemic. So I'm going to kind of give you a lot of the big, kind of big picture thinking that I'm doing. There's a little bit of historiography, there's a little bit of philosophy, and then there's some case studies. And all the case studies I'll talk about today, I'll talk about in the book. I don't have time to do all of them, so I'm not going to talk about Sushi Takanuchi's work today. But if you have questions about that, you can ask. So without further ado, I'm going to read a little bit and talk to you and go back and forth just because I want to make sure that I cover everything I wanted to say. So ever since Hijikata's Kamaitachi project with Eiko Hosoi was exhibited and published in 1968, there's been a strong connection between Butoh and the ecology of the far north of Japan. And also, as Butoh has spread around the world, the specific connection to Tohoku has expanded to include an attention to all manner of local landscapes and to concepts of nature. In fact, I suggest that Butoh acts as a kind of ecological methodology that reminds participants and witnesses that they're not isolated from their surroundings and asking them how to exist together in a given area. And it even makes me think of the dog who wanted to so desperately to participate in the student performance the other night, was so excited when the dancers emerged. I think it was during the dog part. The dog just wanted to join our dance. So just one small example of what Butoh can do. So by calling this dance ecological rather than the more common term environmental dance, I want to emphasize the inherently interrelational qualities of ecology, what Bottoms et al. Refer to as networks of interdependence, or what Timothy Morton called the mesh, in which all beings, constructions, and objects are interconnected. So this building, this microphone, like not just natural things, but right, we're all interconnected in this mesh that is our world. So in my presentation today, I'm suggesting that there's something specific, which I'm sure will not surprise all of you, to Butoh practices that leads to a radically reordered corporeality, a bodily sensitivity to connections constituted by the ecology itself, by our space. Right? This morning, Seisaku said, "You are all these bodies are your body. The space is your body." Right? And that Butoh acts as a kind of embodied and practiced ecological consciousness that's fundamentally attuned to this kind of interdependence. So, and moreover, I suggest that this disorganization and transformation of the Butoh body is in fact a fundamental ecological skill. To be willing to let go of who we are as humans and to become various kinds of prehistoric creatures that I don't remember how to pronounce, but that we are practicing today, to become, in Joan's scores, monkeys or dogs, or in my scores, you had all sorts of animals, right? So to be able to do this, let go of who we are as human individuals in order to ensure the collective survival of the more than human world. This is something that I think that Butoh helps us do. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to discuss some historical and some contemporary examples in my talk today. And these examples are from Japan, Europe, and North America, that not only situate themselves, quote unquote, in nature, because what is not nature, right? We can discuss that later, but also explicitly present the dance as a way to get to know that place, and to form a relationship with its particular histories. So I'm taking the claims of these practices seriously. I'm just assuming that Butoh does this, and so trying to dig into how does it do this, and why does it do this. So when I started talking to people, I really kind of started with a question of like, why do we in Butoh think that this is something we can do, right? So I started just interviewing so many people. I lost count of how many people I've interviewed about this. I've not interviewed you yet. That'll come. And they almost everybody talks about Hijikata and Tohoku. So I want to talk a little bit about the Kamaitachi series with Eiko Hosoi, because this is really where I think that this story that we tell ourselves comes from. So we heard some wonderful history from Bruce the other day. I'll just rehearse it a little bit, maybe in a little bit more poetic way. So Butoh developed as part of the Japanese avant-garde in the late 50s and early 60s in Japan as a decidedly urban practice. It was nurtured in nooks and crannies of Tokyo's underbelly, from burlesque clubs to avant-garde theaters. And Tatsumi Hijikata and his early collaborators, including people like Kazuo Yoshito Ono, Akira Kasai, who's coming next year to the festival, amazing. Mitsutake Ishii and Natsu Nakajima, rest in peace, were interested in rejecting the socialization of the body, right? They're like, our bodies have been trained to do something, and we do not want to do that. Vanessa's up here. And they also wanted to arouse intense reactions from their audiences, right? They did not want this kind of smooth, easy new society that was being built and being promoted by the government, by businesses, by the Tokyo Olympics, by the 1970 World's Fair, all those things. But in 1968, this inherently urban avant-garde orientation of Butoh, both to the Japanese avant-garde and, as we heard the other day, to the avant-garde from New York, from Paris, all these avant-gardes were very much in conversation with each other. People in Japan are translating what people are writing elsewhere. There's very much an exchange here going on. But with the Kamaitachi project, this sort of urban avant-garde orientation of Butoh gets challenged by introducing the image of Tohoku. So Tohoku is where Hijikata grew up. Eiko Hosoi, the photographer who also just passed recently, rest in peace, had been sent there as a child during the Tokyo air raids. So he had also spent part of his childhood in Tohoku. And Hosoi invited Hijikata to do this project. Hijikata was, he was pretty much like, left that behind, I don't want to go back, and Hosoi convinced him to do this project. So it was not a nostalgic project. They both had very complicated feelings for the region. And the photographs they produced for the exhibition and the book are mythic and wicked. Hijikata frolics in rice fields. I forgot to change the slide, so there you go. So this is, there's the first image in the Kamaitachi book is in Tokyo, in Shitamachi, and then the rest of the book transitions to Tohoku. I could spend a whole talk just talking about these photos. I'm not going to. If you haven't seen the book, you can get a fairly inexpensive version online from your favorite bookseller. For a while, it was only in limited editions, but now it's commercially available. So in the photographs, Hijikata frolics in rice fields, pulls half-naked women into small alleys, he leaps like a demon amongst a clutch of laughing children, and at one point he himself, and that's this, seems to embody the sickle weasel of the book's title. So Kamaitachi is the sickle weasel. It's a sort of myth of Japan that the sickle weasel will come. So he's running pell-mell across a dead rice field, and apparently abducted child plunged to his open chest. So this rural northern setting of the photos formed the basis for a new orientation for Hijikata's Butoh, away from the experimental and happening style of much of the work of the 1960s. Again, this is coming out in '68. And towards what we come to know as his score, so much of what we were learning from Saga-san earlier in the festival, where he's really building this meticulously refined movement vocabulary based on this layered choreographic process, which we heard a lot about from Saga and learned a little bit more about from Seisaku. So this is first articulated in the piece Hijikata Tatsumi, the Japanese people rebelling to the body, sometimes also translated as revolt to the flesh, which is the piece with the golden phallus, where he's also the girl, and so Bruce showed us pictures of that. And then really decisively, his new style really comes together in 1972's 27 Nights for the Four Seasons, and Saga taught us a little score from that piece, the part of that piece that she did. And so for the last decade or so of his life, Hijikata dies in '86, so from the early '70s to '86, he kind of dedicated himself to work he called Tohoku Kabuki. And there's a series called Tohoku Kabuki Plan that he did in the last year of his life. And he says about this project, this is the image of Hosotan, which is part of the 27 Nights. So he said of Tohoku Kabuki, I'm cramming in all that is part of the image of Tohoku: rice paddies, the sky, the wind, and salty foods. If classical ballet stands for an extension upwards towards heaven, I cling to the land and return to the inside of my own body. So I think the word image here is really key. Hijikata's dance relationship with Tohoku was much more conceptual and philosophical. He was not making site dances. I mean, other than the Kamaitachi project, he was not going back to Tohoku to make site dances. So that was not his work. But he really was very interested in dancing his idea of the region. And it's really important to note that this image of Tohoku is more than just landscape. It includes the people, it includes the culture, their foods. So it's not the sort of capital N nature that seems to is supposed to be kind of pristine, separate from humans. It's very much the whole ecology of Tohoku that begins to appear in Hijikata's work. In the discourse of the time, so this is late 60s, right? We're in a period of rapid industrialization, rapid urbanization in Japan. So people are leaving rural areas, coming to the cities. Japan is really showing itself to be a power on par with the Western powers. Thus the 64 Olympics, the 1970 World's Fair was really kind of like, yeah, we're here, we're on this global stage. So the north of Japan at this time is really kind of considered, like Hicksville, right? It's the site of the rural, the local, and also in the discourse of the time, the far north was the place of the indigenous. And there is an indigenous population in Hokkaido, which is the island that's north. The Tohoku is not in the farthest north island. So there is an indigenous Ainu people in the far north. So there begins to be some interest in kind of prehistoric cultures. So that this kind of recourse to the north at this time is a particular sort of political stance that's against this kind of urban orientation, right? So Hayato Kosuge, who is a professor at Keio University and works with Kai-san, has noted that at the time the urban stood for modern, civilized, Western, whereas the rural was seen as indigenous and pre-modern. So in this context, this is kind of what Hijikata establishing as Tohoku Kabuki is really reaching for that. So a recourse to the north at that time was like a challenge to this, to the urbanization and the industrialization of Japan via the staging of people and bodies and practices that were rapidly being discounted in this sort of rapidly industrializing society. At the same time, the move also called back to a Japanese history that predated the country's recent imperialism, right? So it's kind of reaching back previous, earlier than the imperial past. And then both of these gestures in general were common to the Japanese avant-garde. That was not specific to Hijikata. So this is kind of part of that zeitgeist. I will say that the complexities of what the North represented in the late 60s in Japan does not always translate when Butoh travels across the world, right? So we get this idea of like, oh, Tohoku, Hijikata's from there, oh, the North, and it kind of becomes a little bit more romanticized as it travels and it gets further away from Japan. I'll come back to that idea in a little bit. And I think sometimes in some of the international Butoh projects as well, it tends to be like veers more towards like a nature with a capital N, but we'll get there. The one complication to this idea is that, well, it's not, anyway. So at the time, Hijikata himself is not romanticizing the North, right? He's showing bodies that have been shaped by the landscape. You know, in Hosotan, he's showing bodies that have been affected by leprosy. So he's not trying to hide it. But at the time, there's also this kind of Discover Japan campaign that was happening in the country that increasingly started to idealize the rural. So it's like it's complicated in larger society. So even as industrialization is starting to have serious impact on people's bodies through industrial poisoning of rivers, which led to things like Minamata disease, and rural communities were being decimated, this kind of reconceiving of the backwards rural into this idealized idea of what Japan is kind of that gets complicated. And, Bruce argues that when the title of the 1968 piece, Hijikata Tatsumi of the Japanese people, that Bruce talked about it, it's like, well, he had to figure out, okay, what is that? And so he's really complicating it, but some of his critics kind of idealized it. So just like keep in mind this kind of tension between romanticization of the North and the kind of honest critique of what that life was actually like. So increasingly, as we get more into the 70s, Hijikata's choreographic statements about the North, for example, like his use of the bow-legged stance, starts to get what she's taking from Tohoku rice farmers, right? They're wet rice agriculture farmers, and so they're moving in a homolateral way, bent over, right? So when he uses that body in his pieces, some critics start then interpreting that in very essentialist and nationalist ways, both in Japan and beyond. So many scholars and critics took this kind of as a matter of course and further developed it in their writing in a way that erased the avant-garde influences or erased the inherent critique, that kind of like this gesture that Vanessa made earlier, right? So some of the interpretations of the work then sort of like, oh, well, he's identifying the essence of what it means to be Japanese. This example for Tetsuji Takeuchi's interpretation of this Nanba gate, this is what it's called, as the true Japanese Nanba, and Masakatsu Gunji's linkage of Hijikata's bow-legged stooped position, and so he sort of said, oh, well, he's citing kabuki there, right? So there's people who are taking this fairly radical move that he's making, trying to stage bodies that are ignored by the nation, and then some critics are trying to recuperate that back to the nation and make it, he's performing the essence of Japaneseness. So again, we see this tension, right? I'm going to read a fairly long quote from Miriam Sass, because I think this is really something interesting. Somebody move the, thank you. I thought I tested all the slides, but I guess I missed that one. That's very hard to, oh yeah, maybe you could just like move it actually over physically. Yeah, there we go. But I think Miriam Sass's critique is really helpful because she really points to the complicated nature of what he's doing. She says, some might argue that by the very fact of calling insistently upon the quote-unquote Japanese body, for example, in the Garamata, the bow-legged farmer figure, in Hijikata's Tohoku Kabuki, Butoh's rhetoric granted it an inevitable series of associations. Yet while he cites particular types, Hijikata re-articulates them in the form of a dance, and thus in a far less deterministic framework. The body that Hijikata describes continually evacuates itself in this odd relation he enacts between thought and flesh. If its walk moves strangely, with difficulty, it finds its direction only through the vacillation and hesitations. I feel like this is the Seisaku was getting at this complication today. The home it seeks, towards which it heads rather than at which it necessarily arrives, remains deferred and temporarily askew. In Hijikata's language, the body dances around the idea of home and flexibly reinvents its strategic essentialisms, rather than claiming to have located home itself. So I think that Sass kind of captures the complicated gestures that Hijikata is making. He's referencing these things, but then really not saying, this is what it is to be Japanese, as sometimes his work is interpreted. So, nonetheless, these close associations of the rural North and bodily movements specific to Hijikata's choreographic project have accrued to Butoh more broadly and persist across time and space. So as Butoh began to circulate, first unofficially in the 70s and then decisively in the early 80s, so when I say unofficially, a lot of people who had been at AsbestosCon or with Ono, people like Eiko and Combo start touring Europe, but they don't necessarily call their work Butoh. So the word Butoh doesn't start appearing in international circles until really the early 80s. late 70s, early 80s. But when that started happening, and this, Bruce pointed to this the other day too, these kinds of essentialist notions started to really stick to Butoh, right? Bruce talked about the reception in France, and which was in the middle of this big Japanese movement, and so there were already this kind of Orientalist idea circulating, and then they saw, Morobushi and Karate Ikeda and Yumiko Yoshioka, and we're like, wow, which is amazing because it gave them a lot of work, and that's how Butoh started circulating, right? But then these ideas, things like, and Sylvain Pagès talks about this in The Religious Companion, that these essentialist associations internationally came to stand for things like tradition, Zen, idealized notions of nature. They get compared to rock gardens a lot. And then also, this came up a little bit the other day in our discussion, a sort of a post-nuclear prehistory, right? This kind of, we bumped them back into the Stone Ages idea. And this is not necessarily because of what the performers were doing, but because of the discourses that already existed, in North America and Europe when Butoh started circulating. And also, as we know, since Hijikata himself did not tour outside of Japan, and it really became some of his students, and then soon thereafter Ono, Kazuo Ono and Yoshito Ono, that it really was kind of dependent on these dancers to convey his ideas. And his writings were not available in translation until well after his death. And the first major set of translation of his works is in 2000 in the TDR special collection. And then we did in the Routledge Companion, we did another round of translations. So for people who don't speak Japanese, a lot of this specific history was missing when Butoh started to circulate. So it kind of got simplified down to Hijikata's from the north, Butoh's from the north. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not really. You probably heard people say this, right? But for me, as not only a dancer but a scholar, I'm really interested in how these stories get perpetuated and the impact and the effects of those. So I rather than just saying like, well, that's not actually what it's about, I'm really curious about then what's the implication of people thinking these things, right? So I want to talk a little bit about Hofu Butoha. I spent some time in Tokyo this year, and then also going up to Hokkaido, researching specifically Hofu Butoha. So in the midst of everything that Hijikata was saying, there were a couple of dancers who said, Hijikata says Butoh's from the north and we're going to move there. And so Bishop Yamada, Ipe Yamada, and Yuki Yoko decide they're going to go north. They take some of their dancers with them. Yamada had lived at Asbestos Con from 69 to 71. He was then a founding member of Daidakuda Con. And Yuki Yuko met Hijikata in 70, and she was the only female founding member of Daidakuda Con. So then they decided they're going to move to the north in 1973 to start Hofu Butoha, which means Northern Butoh School. They first go to Tohoku, where they have kind of this spectacular debut performance, and it's really actually stunning. They just the Hijikata Archive recently started showing the full, it's like a 3-hour epic performance, and there's all these people took the train, and there was no Shinkansen then, so this was like a 13-hour train from Tokyo. All these artists got on the train, they go, and there's film, of course, so there is film of it, and it's one of the films that actually has the original soundtrack, which is very exciting, because as we heard the other day, a lot of these films don't have the original soundtrack. Getting ahead of myself, just in general, so they first moved to Tohoku, then they later move up to Hokkaido. They spent about 10 years in the north, and they get a lot of, they're written about in books and novels, but eventually they moved back to Tokyo. It was just too hard to sustain a full-time company there. Although there are still residences of their presence in Hokkaido. Ito Morita-san, who's in Sapporo, learned Butoh from one of the Hopo Butoh member, so and he teaches classes and is still active in Sapporo, and other folks as well. So they did kind of what they had learned from Hijikata. They start making pieces that are influenced by this landscape. This is one of their events. And then it's a poster for the big, it was kind of like the debut performance of the company. So when they returned to Tokyo, they returned in '84, and then the company made another piece with Hijikata, or Hijikata directed a piece for them in '84. And then he, as I said, died in '86. So for Yamada and Yuki, this experience of Hopo Butoh seemed to impact them differently. Upon his return from the north, Yamada said that he realized that Hijikata's Tohoku was not a real place, but rather a performed one. And he said, in front of a real Gozei woman, and Saga talked to like we did a Gozei thing, right? In front of a real Gozei woman, Hijikata is only a toy and plastic. Gozei is the real body, and Hijikata is kyotai, or a performed body. Hijikata's is fake, but it's okay because Butoh is how to create that performed body. So that's Bishop Yamada after this experience. Yuki, on the other hand, moved back to the north where she still lives. She lives in Aomori, like at the foot of a volcano. I went to visit her and she said, "Oh, I wanted to take you down to the creek, but the bears are out today, so we can't go to the creek." And she makes pieces about the migration of swans from like the swans in Siberia winter in Aomori. So she's been making pieces like that. So to this day, like this idea of Hijikata and Tohoku really animates, I think, a lot of the outdoor Butoh being practiced. But Yamada and Yuki's move to the north and the sighting of their dance there, even naming it as such, Hopo Butoh, is really the first instance of a Butoh practice intentionally seeking out a particular landscape for the stimulation it can provide. Their work introduces a sensitivity to connections constituted by the ecology, the people they were living with, the food they were eating, etc. Although I originally coined the term Yuroko Butoh to describe Butoh practitioners who were not from Japan, but taking Butoh back to their own homes and creating a sort of new kind of Butoh with their own culture and landscape, I think that we can consider Hopo Butoh kind of that first new local Butoh. Okay, so that's a little bit of history, like tracing the history of how do we have these ideas that there's something about Butoh in nature. So now I want to think about the Butoh body, because the Butoh body is an important part of this ecological consciousness I'm talking about. So what is this Butoh body? I feel like it's kind of fun to have this, to talk about this as we've been having all these amazing classes and lectures, right? Because this is something that's very fresh in a lot of our minds, right? So we have many common phrases we use to describe the Butoh body. Things like revolt of the flesh, the body in crisis, a corpse trying to stand up, becoming an empty vessel, expanding and erasing, that's Suen's term, or the possibility body. We can go on. I'm also thinking of Hank's empty vessel t-shirt from the other day, which I just love. I really want to make some of those because it's just like so perfect for Butoh. Right. So as I said before, there's something about these practices that are helping us reorder our bodies so that it's no longer a singular body, nor is it necessarily only human. And the idea that, for example, our bodies don't end at our skins. So I think these are all very fundamental ecological skills. So in order for the body to be reordered, it first has to be disorganized. For the Japanese avant-garde in the 1960s, as I said, the first order of the day was to break societal norms, right? Reject the bodily habits instilled by society. So it calls for a kind of canceling of the self, which again we've heard a number of our teachers this week talk about, in which the dancer should give up their social and cultural being and challenge the social and cultural patterns to which they have been, sometimes subtly, sometimes very overtly and deeply trained. So disturbance, kind of like how do we get these out of our body? Like disturbance is a key factor in this. Suen, who along with our own Joan Laggy, did I say it right now, Joan? Turns out I've been saying Joan's name wrong for years, and she only just told me a couple days ago.
It's supposed to be a slight
Just call me Kogu.
Kogu. So Suen and Kogut were in Nome together, Nome. So Suen has written a lot about that process of working with Ashikawa. And so she talks in her workshops that even the smallest thing can cause a great disturbance in your body. Like, if you get a mosquito bite, it can change your experience of your whole body. So Suen is all about disturbances. She said Butoh needs disturbances because it changes our experience, right? So whether that disturbance is doing a really awkward movement, being in a different place, sort of relocating away from your familiar things, etc. So, and of course, the idea about the mosquito, if you've done the Hichikata's bug score, like how very quickly, like that one bug crawling up your thigh, and then there's another one crawling in your hand, and then next you know, 5 become 500, become, your whole body is being consumed, and the bugs are taking over outer space, right? So, that these are the kinds of disturbances that, and sort of disorganization of the body that Butoh allows us.
Rosemary, did we lose your PowerPoint?
Oh, no, there's no slide right now.
Okay, cool.
Thank you for asking, okay. And also, when you think of it, disturbance is key to ecological systems as well, right? It shapes ecosystems, right? Floods reshape landscapes. Fire can clear a forest, but can also germinate new seeds. So disturbance is part of our ecologies. Some people refer to this as crisis, but this is part of this ongoing effort we have to redo, undo, disorganize, erase, break open, empty out. Koma from Eco and Koma would always say, like, I forgot everything. When he tapped his head, I don't know, I forget everything, right? So it's like whatever version of this, everybody has a little bit different way of expressing it, but they all come down to the same thing, right? And what we want to do when we do that, and Seisaku said it so, it was such an interesting way of putting it today. If we still have our own thoughts and feelings, there's not room for something else to come in, right? So it's all about making room for something else. Let me skip that one quote. We go back to Suen. So Suen describes the results of this process in this way. She says, the Butoh body questions the distinction between time and space. It recycles its environs. It is an organism, not a shape. Butoh dares to transform the initial reality of the body into a disparate reality of living matter. The body merges with space, and the confrontation can commence. The Butoh body is the work. The Butoh body is a battlefield, a condition of being. She's a very effective writer. That's from her. She has a book called The Body in the World. It's published both in Swedish and English. So from Suen's description, we can see the Butoh body is already multiple. Images, sensations, timescapes, spaces, forces working together, or maybe at odds, or in parallel tracks. As Michael Sakamoto writes in his book, the Butoh body's multiplicity results in multiple images and bodies interacting with each other, producing a singular dialogue in the dancer's body between multiple and competing aspects of desire and reality. This expression thus returns us to Butoh's political nature. And I would extend this to also include Butoh's ecological nature. So we can think of cultivating this kind of body as a kind of embodied staying with the trouble. If you've read Donna Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble, to me, Butoh is a kind of staying with the trouble, right? And Haraway writes, the trouble of learning to be truly present, entwined in myriad and unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, meanings, end quote. And so we can even imagine her term the Thulu scene as a kind of Butoh body, or one of Joan's monster creatures, a time place for learning to save the trouble of living and dying in responsibility on a damaged earth. That's Haraway. So far I've really been focusing on Kijikata, this sort of articulation, layering, rearticulation associated with his practices. But Kazu Ono's attentions to cycles of life and death and rebirth is really a key addition to the Butoh body. And a lot of people I interview also cite Ono as well as kind of why they feel like that they can do this sort of work. So for Ono, the body is not necessarily disorganized, but rather is the vehicle for the soul to dance, which Seisaku had us leaving, the soul leaving the body today. So for Ono, that soul would go off and do a nice dance, right? But rather than focusing on the individual self, however, Ono's emphasis is really on a kind of a cosmology that's attuned to death and rebirth. It really creates this kind of, and he uses this word, universal Butoh body that then becomes open to moving through space-time with as flowers, archetypes, ancestors, etc. So this approach calls on dancers in Ono's lineage to, as Sakamoto writes, bear active witness for the other by allowing the instigation, resonance, and consequent activity, which he says is life itself, of the other in their self. This is the Butoh body's interrelational potential. So this allowing of the potential of life in your own body. And this really resonates with how ecological scholar Timothy Morton conceptualizes what he calls the mesh, in which the quantum, the planetary, and the mundane, this podium, this microphone, all of our bodies here, we're all exist in dynamic relationship to each other. And although what's interesting about Morton's idea of the mesh is even though everything is interconnected, it's like a spider web, so there's also all these gaps and holes, right? So it's not like we're all just people aren't fake, right? There are these tensions, these gaps, these pulled strings. It's both the linkages and the holes between the links that make this connection. So Ono's Butoh body is attempting to expand to encompass this mesh. It might magnify a particular part of the mesh, or it might travel along the mesh in order to reach an other who can then be brought into focus in the dancing body. So it works a little bit differently in Ono, but there's still this sort of potential in the body. And this allowing of the other into the body is what many refer to as transformation or becoming. But it's specifically a transformation that's meant to be shared beyond just the individual dancer, right? So as Evangeline writes, transformation in Butoh places the body at a crossroads between the physical and metaphysical realms. This aims at making multiple levels of reality manifest. The Butoh body is an invitation for the audience, or the other, to have access to these levels and to share in the same space, right? So the dancer is doing the work of making that sort of manifest in the space with the audience. And at the same time, Sakamoto notes that in our attempt as Butoh artists to embody absurd and surreal images and enter a crisis state, we allow ourselves to experience a falling short of those desires. And so by noting the gaps or the separation between self and other, we thereby learn some truth about ourselves, enabling us to operate with greater clarity about and sympathy for others. And that's a quote from Sakamoto. So in this way, the Butoh body and performance opens up spaces of possibility that may be entered by witnesses. At the same time, the persistence of the separation between the dancer and the image, the dancer and the audience, or the not self and others, despite this desire to do it, can arouse new potential, like new ways of being in the world, right? So it's kind of almost by falling short, like never being able to perfectly inhabit the image, we're opening these new possibilities. So I want to just take a little bit of time to talk about 3 of my case studies from my book in progress. So the first one is Suen. She is from Sweden. She was in Japan in the late 80s, just happened to be there, happened to see a performance of Ashikawa's, and was like, what is this? I must do this. Then, as I said, I worked in Noma, along with Joan. So then she went back to Sweden and started a Butoh company there. And she really connects her Butoh a lot to the Nordic landscape and the Swedish landscape. She has kind of stopped holding her seasonal Butoh camps, but she used to do kind of once a season would hold Butoh camps. She used to tour quite a bit as well. I think she's kind of winding down her teaching, or largely studying in Sweden these days. So she has an old schoolhouse complex in rural Sweden that used to just be like the schoolhouse for all the rural kids. So she has that whole compound now. And when I asked her why she chose Haglandskola as a base for her teaching and choreography, she said that living in nature constantly teaches you what you do not know and how much you do not know. And moreover, it provides the kind of obstacles or disturbances that she finds essential to Butoh. So she said in her workshop that if you're walking in a dance studio, there's it's kind of designed to not provide any obstacles to you, right? The floor is nice and smooth, ideally, depending where you're dancing. But it's really there to facilitate movement. And to a large extent, cities are as well, right? Sidewalks, depends on your mobility. Not all cities are designed for everyone's mobility, but in general, cities are kind of designed to help us move, right? Get to where we're going. So for Suen, if you're living in the forest, and we have our friends from Prehistoric Body Theater who are living in a forest, talked about, well, we can't really do our outdoor work right where we live because there's a lot of poisonous snakes and spiders, right? So that's like a lot of obstacles to confront, right? So Suen is really interested in these obstacles or things that, like, nature is constantly doing something you're not expecting or prepared for. So she feels like this is essential training for the Butoh body. And that we always need to place ourselves in a situation to actively encounter the world anew. In her book, she says, the body is the world is the body. And for her, Butoh is a struggle, it's a dangerous process, and she even uses the word, she says it could even be a terrifying practice because it requires facing the world and being challenged to change one's appearance and one's understanding. The emphasis on the one hand with Suen is on acknowledging how much you don't know, while at the same time cultivating the willingness and ability to encounter the unknown. So, do a little snapshot of her training programs. They would usually be about 10 days to 2 weeks. Maybe like a fairly small group, 12 to 15 dancers. Usually very European-based, but very international. In the morning, we would get assigned into practical work teams. So I was like on the gardening team, for example. There were other people who were on the painting team or roofing team. So I spent my mornings doing a lot of weeding, for example. Although there was one day when we got to smash old roof tiles. It was the most satisfying. Because then she would use it as kind of a mulch. So then in the afternoon, we would work with what she calls body materials, which kind of are akin to Butoh, but she's created her own body materials that are related to the Swedish landscape, Swedish seasons. And then during our free time, she had a library that we could explore. And in the evening, she gave lectures and we would watch films. We made great meals. Very simple. It's like a very Spartan existence because we were supposed to have no distractions from the work at hand. You had to have your phone was always away. It was supposed to be kind of quiet. No singing "Country Roads Take Me Home" as it was happening this evening. So it's everything is so focused, so you can just give everything to the practice. And the practical work, so I mentioned I was weeding. It's meant to provide a way to become familiar with the landscape, much like body weather, the body weather farm. Like through farming different vegetables, you would learn different ways that your body was connected to the earth. Like the way you would pick potatoes is very different than how you would pick tomatoes, right? Or different vegetables require different bodies. So it was a way of training your body. For Sue-Ann, the practical work was also a way to learn group problem solving. And again, we weren't supposed to talk a lot or loudly. So it kind of like learning how to work together, how to sense each other, and relating the body to the environment. So after that morning, encountering what the rural Swedish environment offered, so rain, bugs, dirt, the most amazing slugs I've ever seen. Afternoon basic training in her spare high-ceiling studio provided a very different environment in which to train our bodies. So exercises here were designed to cultivate a body that's always seeking to meet the world around it, so always encountering the world. Like breathing, for example, for Sue-Ann is about breathing in all directions, so you're moving out into the world even with your breath. And for her, rather than becoming an empty vessel, it's about expanding your body and then erasing your joints on kind of the hard parts of your body so that other things can enter into your body, so like this expanded body. And it's into the expanded and erased body that then the Butoh body materials can enter. Sue-Ann's body materials involve a lot of smells, because for her, smell is something that travels beyond like the boundaries of the body. She talks about like there's a rotting apple or some rotting food. You're like, where's that coming from, right? Because it's once that apple starts to rot, the appleness is like extending beyond it in a particular way. So she's very interested in smell for that reason, because it's not about the borders of a body. She has a body material called rotting process, because like they have a very short, warm season in Sweden. It's very damp there. So that kind of high summer is called rotting season, because things then start to rot because it's so damp and warm. And while Sue-Ann never used the word self or subject or object, I came to understand her workshops as training for how to become an object in relationship to other objects. So it's not that I'm a special human embodying this other thing, but that I'm learning how to be an object along with other objects. And through that, I think you really begin to grasp dancing the space as a risky yet necessary way of encountering the world. So that's Sue-Ann. I want to talk about body weather a little bit, and particularly Frank van de Ven's body landscape work. And then, Joan, you've had Frank to Seattle at least a couple times, right?
Yeah.
Somewhere recently.
I just saw him last year.
So some of you might have trained with Frank in the past. So just a brief introduction to body weather. Min Tanaka started leading body weather workshops in the 70s, and body weather before he completely kind of disowned it. It's like all he wants to do is make movies now, evidently. Which if you saw, what's the name of the movie? Perfect Days.
Perfect Days.
Perfect Days, that's Min Tanaka dancing in it. So body weather, Tanaka insists, is not a dance style but an ideology for dance in life. It's a methodology for bodily research, and they use that term a lot in body weather. It's centered on the exploration of the body's landscape, your internal landscape, in the context of the larger environment, in which bodies are not conceived as fixed entities, but just like the weather, are constantly changing through an infinite and complex system of processes occurring in and outside of these bodies. So again, it's a way of, body weather is a way of acquiring information, experience, and stimulation from the physical environment. They use a lot of images like wind and clay and an orientation to sight. And earlier David was describing like amazing Mintanaka piece in Union Square, New York. Was it Union Square, you said? Yeah, he used to do these, what he called hyper dances, where he would dance like anywhere and everywhere, often naked with just a bandage wrapped around his penis. But he also wore a lot of trench coats and things as well. So for him, like nature could be an urban park, it could be a parking lot, it could be a dance studio or a rural setting. And so all of these are considered really important sources of stimulation for training and performance. And when, so he had a company called Manjuku from 86 to 2010, and then hosted trainings on the Body Weather Farm, which was a working farm, and that's how they made money. So no cabaret for Body Weather, it was farming. And it was actually, it was sustainable for a number of years. So I should emphasize that the Butoh body weather connection is a little bit tricky. For many, many years, Mintanaka and other body weather dances like Oguri, with whom I trained for a very long time, were presented internationally as Butoh. They very much claim a relationship to Hijikata, a lineage with Hijikata. Min danced with Hijikata shortly before his death, and there's like a really stunning duet that Min and Ashikawa did together shortly before Hijikata died. But at a certain point, they all stopped using the word Butoh, and some of them were quite anti that. For them, they feel like that Butoh has become sort of fixed as something, which we could very much debate, and they don't want their dance to be associated with something that they feel like has a fixed name. Eiko and Koma are very similar. They've never called their work Butoh, and ask that their work is not called Butoh because they want you to encounter their work as it is, but without a name, so you don't think you know what you're seeing before you see it. But body weather practitioners do hold Hijikata in quite high esteem. But for me, I'm always really interested in not like what is Butoh, like this center point, the official definition. I'm really interested in like how far can it stretch, like Seisaku's cotton image did. How far can this thing that we know as Butoh stretch before it's not Butoh anymore? Like Katsura Khan used to say during rehearsal, like, about what we were doing, is this Butoh? I don't know, what do you think? Like rehearsing for a supposed Butoh performance, and you say, I don't know, is this Butoh? So I've always been kind of interested in the margins, so that's how I justify including body weather in my research. So right now there's a handful of people around the world who, many former Manjuku members, but some others who are still offering body weather training. And Frank van de Ven is one of them. So in the book project, I talk about his training. This is in the Basque Country. Frank is really interested in, he does a lot of training in specifically rural outdoor settings. So he really wants to explore the body's landscape in these particular rural, large natural landscapes. So the training involves a lot of strength, flexibility, and grounding alongside kinesthetic sensitivity to stimulation from the physical environment. So a lot of observation of your own body, a lot of discussing it with others, getting feedback. And while the settings of body landscape might change from mountain meadows and trails of here Itaksu in the Basque Country, he also does trainings like in small Scottish islands, the Lake District in England, etc. The training exercises are the same, no matter where you are, because the idea with body weather, so you repeat the same exercises because your body is always changing. So you develop the ability to really keenly notice what's different today than the last time you did it. What's different in this studio versus doing it in the meadow. So like Hijikata's Butoh, body weather practices are aimed at really disrupting these daily rituals, which is one of the reasons also to go to a new place that is not familiar to you. So this is how Van de Ven describes what he's doing. He says, the workshop proposes strategies to confront our bodies with multiplicity, unpredictability, directness, and autonomy of the natural environment. The aim is to explore and develop consciousness of the body itself, being an ever-evolving landscape within a greater surrounding landscape. So learning how to take this stimulation in is really key to body weather. As Tanaka himself explained, if I have a chance to get stimulation from outside through my skin, I contain more than is in my clothing. That is body weather. It's omnicentral, as if there are many eyes, many centers moving, which I really love that quote. So body weather really cultivates this body that is open, diffuse, and protean. So one of the things about body weather is you do this practice called MB, which a little bit of MB has come up in a number of our trainings this week. I certainly did some in my workshops, that kind of going across the floor with all the different kinds of locomotion. It comes into a little bit into Especticos training, again, like the sort of kicking, as you're going across the floor in different directions, which also Seisako and Yuri incorporate a little bit. So that's kind of MB. Usually if you're doing a workshop, just kind of a regular weekly workshop, they're 3 hours. The first hour, hour and a half is MB. So part of it is like there are these body puzzles for your brain, and you just keep going, keep going, keep going. The idea is to kind of exhaust you, the idea is to exhaust yourself so that you're kind of getting rid of the habits. Because if you're really tired, you're not going to just move in your habitual way. And then you do, depending on the workshop, either some solo stretching or partner stretching, and then you go into image work. So that you're kind of preparing your body, you're exhausting the body, you're stretching it, you're making it available to the images. And usually about the last hour of workshop is image work. So there is, you can also tell yourself that this week as your body gets more sore and tired, like, oh, by doing that, by not being able to move how I would normally move, I'm making maybe something new available to emerge from my body.
So by the end of the week, people are going to be like,
amazing.
amazing.
By Sunday,
Yeah.
incredible, right? So noticing the changes in your body as it becomes fatigued. But then also, like, how quickly can you start to pick up these new things? The follow the leader stuff, even that Yuri was leading today. Like being able to then pick it up more quickly, then you are responding to your environment in a different way. So this body weather training practice is really specifically relational because it comes into being through this active and continual exchange with your surroundings. In Frank's workshop here, we over the week we were creating our own personal image, kind of image dictionary. So we're collecting images from our environment that we added into our sort of movement repertory, right? So this active exchange with the environment. And then rather than the body being at the center of its own kinesphere, like this, right? Like the human body floating in space, right? So rather than that kind of image of the body weather body is expanded and also dispersed, right? And the practices are really designed to lead to a heightened awareness of sensation in the body and its surroundings, and openness to receiving and responding to both. And that resultant dance is constantly in flux because it's always responding to new internal and external stimuli. So I think just given the time, I think I'm going to skip my Diego case study.
There's a lot of Diego people in this community.
All right, I'll send you my Diego.
You still have time.
Okay, so as an artist, Diego talks about sort of when he was starting out as an artist, he was always searching for how to move beyond the present, saying, I've been asking myself constantly how to open access, even if it's for a few moments, to the pure and regenerative state that is part of the mystery of life, and surely also of death, through a ritual act in which the deepest of being is exposed from a state of innocence, humility, and surrender. Obviously, very much influenced by Ono, not Mahijikata. In his life, he says that encountering Butoh provided an avenue for how to do this. And he says, for him, Butoh is a symbol, a name to connect the feet to the earth, asking to the earth, reverence in front of nature, the source of life. As I guess many of you know, he had significant studies with Milton Nakajima in Mexico, and then in Japan with Kazuo Ono and Yoshito Ono, and also with Tanaka. Although I feel like in his own trainings, you don't feel the Tanaka as much. And he used to call his practice Butoh Ritual Mexicano, and now calls it Butoh Ritual Movement. So according to artist scholar Joy Flew, Pignon shares with his teachers, quote, an obsession with the relationship between body, environment, history, and finding a way to dance oneself free. And artist scholar Nikki Seifert writes that through her training with Pignon, she came to understand Butoh as awakening the energy of rebellion and seeking to use this energy as a force to propel a creative, transformative expression that breaks through the confines placed on one's body, by oneself, family, education, society. So again, that kind of breaking the society's training. And Mickey writes, for us, Butoh seeks to liberate the mind from the way it habitually thinks, the body from the way it habitually moves, and the self from how it habitually conceives of itself and the world. And if you've ever been to a training, which sounds like many of you have, Diego often says, liberate, liberate, right? And it's all about detaching from ego, from parents, from expectations, trauma, etc. For Diego, Butoh is not something that's unique to Japan, but rather it's an orientation between humans and the earth that he finds in other non-Western societies. And this is something also that I heard from Waguru Yukio when I interviewed him. He used to work quite a lot in Thailand and other places in Southeast Asia, and he said for him it's not about Japan specifically, but about that spirit of breaking with society. So he felt like at the time when he was working in Thailand, so I really see the spirit in Thailand. But Butoh is wherever that spirit emerges, and that sort of counter societal urge from the body is coming forward. So of his training center in Tlapuawa, Diego says, why I work and explore in the abandoned gold and silver mines where colonization gloried in its power through the exploitation and abuse of people on the earth is, first, because it's part of the environment where the center of the work is, and second, because its tunnels, which are accesses to very deep regions, allow the taking of symbolic journeys into oneself, seeking in the silence and the darkness to touch the most unconscious material. So very opposite from, for example, Seisaku, who's like, no thoughts, no feelings, it's not about you, it's not about the self, right? So for a lot of people in Ono's lineage, very much about the self, but not the self as an end point, going into those things so that you can really make that space for the other that I was talking about earlier. Or for Diego, it's to make that space, to open up the ritual space for the audience, to get to a place that could transform not only the self, or not only the dancing body, but society at large. Right, so deep, as I was saying, deeply influenced by Ono, Pignon's work travels through time, space, into personal past, ancestral past, but also far into the future. And like Ono, his dance is less about the disorganization of the body, so much it is about the disorganization of the self in order to collectively connect to things much broader than ourselves in the service of healings of the individuals on the planet. So the transformation sought here is not so much in the Butoh body itself. Rather than becoming other on stage, the body here becomes a channel for intuition and spirit, especially when joined with other performing bodies that collectively work towards a transformation of the whole, including humans and more than humans alike. And so by materializing the ethereal through ritual performance, we aim to integrate the unconscious wisdom of the mesh. So what I've tried to do in this talk is to articulate both the historiography and the praxis of ecological Butoh that offers possibilities to alter our collective understanding of bodies and the earth, and to detail how the Butoh body disorganizes out of habitual patterns and is reordered into a new ecological ways of being. So many of the specific lineages, influences, and trainings of the practices I discussed today may differ. They all share in common a belief in the value of working with local landscapes, that there's an important connection to be made between humans and nature through dance, and that there's something in this practice that's fundamental to Butoh and Butoh-related practices that leads towards this radically reordered corporeality I was talking about at the beginning. And although, just to wrap it up, although Hijikata and Ono's connections to nature were more mythic and metaphorical than material, they weren't often leading people out. I mean, Ono did make some outdoor pieces, but it wasn't like workshop happened in his studio, right? With him lecturing, and then he would get up and he would dance with a plastic rose. Grossly, simplifying, of course. But their emphasis on a particular region as a source for dance or entry into a universal connection have been the fuel for the dispersion of Butoh outside of Japan's urban centers and the adaptation of Butoh to many locations and cultures for 5 decades now. And because of this, Butoh has been adopted well beyond its origins in the 1960s Japanese avant-garde. People are not still doing the painting practices or sculpture practices of the 1960s avant-garde. But somehow we're still doing this practice because there's something about it that's continually being renewed, I think, through this travel around the world and through this connection to new landscapes, through this connection to new places, that it feels like there's still something to explore for people. And for me, I think that Butoh training is a kind of experiential learning for how to be in the world differently. That it helps us recognize and rehearse human and more than human interconnections in a very real way, right? We actually rehearse them, we practice them. And so for me, Butoh then is a really vital tool for grappling with environmental crisis by offering the opportunity to develop a new kind of embodied ecological praxis. So I think, this is my opinion here, but I think, policies are great, but if people don't understand that their body is fundamentally connected to the world around them, behaviors are not going to change. When behaviors don't change, then there's no stopping environmental crisis, right? So for me, this is like a very existential practice that can have very deep consequences. And I don't think this is the only movement form out there that can do it, but I think there are a lot of things that are very special and specific to Butoh that make it possible. So that means I also think that it's really important and urgent for this work to happen, this work that we're all doing together. I think I'm going to end it there. That's my email. Do you want to email me? And my website. Since Bruce did some shameless plugging, I'll leave that there for a second. I'll show you my work in a minute.
Thank you so much.
They do not call their work Butoh. I do a lot of tracing of their early history in Japan. And then I also have a chapter where I really analyze all the discourses around their work and particularly how that changes. When they first came to the US, they were considered like the avant-garde of modern dance. And then once Butoh started circulating internationally, they started being treated, called Japanese rather than they started being othered by the critics who had just welcomed them as part of the vanguard of modern dance. And I talk a lot about sort of how those discourses around the nuclear develop around Butoh, so that if anybody's interested in that discussion we had the other night, I have a chapter on that. And then here, Here's a QR code. I have no book giveaway tonight because Bruce and I have already given our book away. So if you go to that QR code, it'll take you to the link on the Rutledge website, and you can have free open access to the book online. It is still available in paperback, much cheaper than the original hardback. It's about $50, but it's a 550-page book. It has 54 chapters with 56 authors from 14 countries. It's historians, it's dancers, it's there's poetry, there's personal reflection on dancing with Butoh. There's history. It ends with Shinichi Yomakoga's chapter that says, burn Butoh so that I may begin again, which is really beautiful. So please get the book, use the book. This is our gift to you.
Thank you, Rosemary. Questions for Rosemary? And let's begin.
Aaron.
Yes, thank you. What a lovely talk. I'm sort of new to Butoh, and maybe it's, I don't know, it's sort of maybe a basic question, but so one thing that I've come to appreciate about it is the use of the imagination or the imaginary. But I feel like so much in what you're talking about, what Butoh is, it's about like disrupting, and with the example of like the smells, like creating these alternative experiences that our body can have. Why not just do the real thing? Like, why not be in a workshop where there's dead fish everywhere and I'm smelling actual dead fish, or where there's hooks actually in my flesh? Like, why the imagination? I guess is my question. Why not just the real thing?
So it's kind of like a Butoh versus performance art question. In a way, right? I mean, I'm not being facetious.
Yeah,
right?
Sure, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, because they're definitely performance artists who put hooks in their bodies and suspend themselves from the ceiling.
But
right?
it sounds like much of what you're saying about Butoh would be about that. Like that would create this kind of like disruption of the habitual.
Yeah. I think, and in Butoh's history, that first decade was much more experimental. I don't think anybody did actually put hooks in them. They did have a scratch and sniff program for an early concert. They were like, I think, there were like boxes that had like, dildos and things, and like there was like a lot of that kind of tactile experience. There were painters painting vulvas on the backs of the male dancers, and again, we're all upstage moving. There were people riding bicycles through. So I think there is that kind of, like the plaster of Paris story that Bruce told the other night, where they put on plaster of Paris, also not realizing it was really toxic because they wanted it to crack. And over time that becomes, a different kind of makeup, and then the Sankaijiku gets very is that pure, soft, white, body that's very kind of beautiful. Whereas the early it was like they were trying to move dry plaster of Paris on their bodies, and it was cracking because they were moving. So I think some of that experimentation did happen in the beginning, and then when kind of this the kind of those early pieces that were starting to explore the Japanese body come up, that's when it's very layered choreographic. So I think Bruce described it in his first book as in the first decade, there's multiple things happening on stage, but when you get into the 70s, it's multiple things happening in the body. So it's kind of just a change in the practice that went away from the sort of more extreme things that we'd still see in a kind of performance art practice. I think part of it is because Ono and Hijikata were really interested in the image of them and kind of in Hijikata's writings, which are so evocative, we need to consider those also part of his creative practice, and so he's doing a lot of these kind of sort of violent, bizarre images in his writing rather than in real life. I don't know if that's a super satisfying answer, but that's kind of how I'm interpreting that kind of move away from the sort of, let's just do a bunch of crazy shit on stage, but then like really kind of honing this practice that becomes kind of what we know as Butoh. Yeah, in the back row. Yeah, you.
It's me.
It's you.
I have a question about when you were talking about Mintanaka, or no, not Mintanaka, Suen. You were talking a bit about objectification, and the way you were talking about Suen's relationship to the body as object seems, in some ways, complementarily reversed from narratives about everything being sacred. Can you talk a little bit more about re-objectification and kind of what that entails in a world that has reduced the natural world to objects?
Yeah, I think this is really coming from, and this is not to say that Suen is specific, like saying, oh, my practice is like object-oriented ontology. That's me saying that. And I think in object-oriented ontology, it's really, I hadn't thought about it in the way that you asked that question, but my understanding of object-oriented ontology is less that we're making everything, like object here doesn't mean not sacred, but it's really a way of changing, like humans, like that sort of human-centeredness of everything.
Yeah.
And if we're thinking of humans as part of this world of objects, then we're giving a different kind of centrality to a chair and decentering the kind of humans. So for me, that's not necessarily like an anti-sacred, but it's sort of like seeing, by decentering humans, we're giving attention to the other things around us.
Whereas the impulse to animate the natural world and make it human as it's the other direction of taking the human and bringing it down to what we have objectified.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what I'm
Yeah, and then saying like, we think that the rock is just there for us to use because it's an object, but if we understand that we're all objects among objects, then that's a sort of, I don't really want to use the word leveling, but that's what's coming to me. It's more sort of then looking at everything on a kind of even playing field. Like if we're thinking about all these things, and to use Morton's mesh term, like if we're all part of the mesh, then the thermos, the water bottle, I'm using shoes, the microphone, like everything, we're all part of something, and then that by having us all relate on that, from that perspective, is then, to me, that opens up a lot of possibilities about how we see the world around us, and then how we treat the world around us if we understand that it's that we're all related.
Are you familiar with the word animism? Can I ask a secondary question to this question? Do you have any perspective as to why the word animism isn't more explicitly used when talking about Butoh? Because so much of what you're talking about, I feel, is very correlative to like animistic ontologies. Yeah.
I don't have a great answer for you, but I think that's a really great point. Yvonne has been kind of leading the Butoh field in terms of fungal images and mycelium and helping us think in that way. So, like, you or somebody else in this room wants to take up animist Butoh, that would be exciting.
And Michael Sakamoto wrote an article or an essay that was published a while back, before his book came out, where he talks a little bit about animism, but he's talking more about the parallels between Butoh and some sonic trance-ritual practices. And so I think that would be of interest to you.
Probably when he's working in Thailand. Yeah. That's a good point. Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, Margaret.
I'm curious, at the beginning of your talk, talking about Butoh being associated with northern landscapes and things like that, how far north Butoh has been present going to a northern location to experience that, or to perform outside, possibly interact with local people there, those type of things. And if there's been very much of extreme north things going on with people very dedicated or things like that.
Do you mean outside Japan?
Anywhere in my own perspective, extreme north doesn't exist in Japan, but that's my own.
Yeah, so when I talk about Butoh being from the north, it's specifically the north of Japan.
Yeah.
Like, so in Butoh sort of mythology, and I say that not in a dismissive way, but like these are the stories we tell. Like, this is the stories that Hijikata told. It's specifically the north of Japan.
But have people, for example, gotten this idea and said, yes, I'm going to go to the northern Laplands and do this thing because they were inspired by it?
I mean, not that I know. Most of when I'm talking about like new local Butohs, it's often people going to their own communities. I'm not aware of Butoh dancers from Laplands. There might be. But that's sort of the imagery of the north is specifically the north of Japan. Preview, my future project, once this book project is done, is Butoh of the South. Because for me, the really exciting work that's happening is in Mexico, it's in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, it's happening in Australia, it's happening in the Philippines and South Africa. So that I'm really excited about that. And when I was in Japan last, Caitlin Coker told me that, and I've never read this before, and so I have to get the source from her, but she said that Hijikata said that Byakusha was Butoh's southern cousin. So, and our 2027 festival, I've been told, is going to be a Byakusha focus, which is very exciting for me. I mean, they're from Kyoto, so it's like, southern cousin. But they were also kind of like doing wild stuff in the forest, right? So, yeah.
Well, I found what you said at the end and just sort of the whole theme of the talk really moving about Butoh being this like pathway into being in better relationship with other than humans and ecology, and like that's like really articulates why I think I love Butoh, and like seeing these like descriptions of these like workshops that are so intensive, and like how lucky we are to get to be in workshops. But I guess I feel like less maybe that when I'm an audience member, but so I'm wondering like if any of your research is around audience responses to this, and like people getting that feeling if you're being in an audience.
That's a great question. And my answer to that is, so when I first started making my own work, because I also have a whole practice research component to this, first a set of work I did in North Texas when I moved there, and then I have a kind of long-term project right now called Aqueous, which is about water, and particularly water in Texas. And so there's a stage version, which you'll see tomorrow night, and then there's an outdoor version, which happens in a handmade boat on different bodies of water, which could be seasonal. They could be places that used to be a pathway for water, and now there's no water. Rosemary Candelario is here from North Texas, who's performing with me tomorrow night. We've performed it, for example, in the former pathway of the Rio Grande River before it was channelized and straightened. So we're in this like sort of dry creek bed, that used to be the Rio Grande with, when did we do it? Like 22, 21? Anyway, there was a border wall, like we couldn't see it from our performance site, but the people who were in that area took us there, and you could feel the effect of the border wall, like on this site. So we do it in sites of like, we also did it on Spring Lake, which is not a proper lake, but it's the spring of the San Marcos River, which has been a sacred indigenous site for 10,000 years. So we're doing it, very slowly doing it at all these different sites across Texas. So when I first started making this work, my idea was, it'll have a profound impact on the dancers. So I have an article where we interview some of our dancers, and they share what changed for them about their bodies from the work. But then I started to hear anecdotally, and this is for outdoor work, anecdotally from audience members, how much it affected their bodies. So I haven't had a chance to like do, because this is kind of the type of research that I don't really do, like it's a little bit more social science. But now that I'm at UT Austin, which has a lot of resources, I have some money this year to do some audience work and to do some pre and post surveys, or to do a workshop with them and see. So I'm really curious, because I didn't necessarily think it would have a direct impact on audiences, but a lot of people told me things like, oh, my body didn't feel the same for days after seeing your performance, or a friend said like her son who was ADHD said he felt so calm for an extended period after the performance. So like I've gotten a lot of feedback like that it's impacting people's bodies, which I didn't expect. So I haven't yet systematically studied that, but I'm looking forward to doing that.
I had an audience member at an ecology-themed performance. You know, I share with Rosemary. I always feel like I stand on her shoulders as big sister, big Butoh sister. We both do ecology-centered work. You'll see my piece on Saturday, Bowels of the Earth. But I had an audience member came up to me in 2017. He worked for Boeing, and he felt so, I guess, touched by the performance, he quit his job on Monday. We're not like close friends, but we're social media friends, and now he moved away, and he lives in Africa, and he started a humanitarian organization. So, you never know.
But when we did the performance in the Embodied wetlands in El Paso, a water engineer who'd been working in the site for decades and helping to restore the original ecology where before the Rio Grande was channelized and straightened. And they've actually done an amazing job at bringing this landscape back. He said after the performance that he would never look at the space the same again, which for me, like to have somebody who's like spent, you know, like I think it's like 3 decades of his work life restoring this, and to say that our performance could even shift his perspective when he is somebody who knows that space so well, that land so well. So that's, I think, you know, it's there. Our dancing matters.
I have
Ivan.
a real question. So I was, beautiful presentation. I was thinking like, okay, so Hijikata does this collaboration with Eiko Soe Kamaitachi, and it's, as you correctly point out, it's so huge in the mythology of Butoh, and it's very influential for future generations. I mean, I just spent a month in Japan, and when I tell all the Japanese researchers and Butoh teachers and artists there that my work's ecology themed, that's always what they bring up. Kamaitachi, Kamaitachi, Kamaitachi. It always comes up. So, but as then, he spent the rest of his life in the urban center, and any traces and remnants of ecology is in the imaginary. It's in the conceptual and philosophical realm for the rest of his life. And something I was thinking about, and that I'd love for you to speak to, is the power and the impact of this practice. Rather than it being seen as like a limitation, you know, rather than it being seen like, oh, you're not dancing in nature anymore. You're not going to the forests. You're not going to the beach. You're not making site-specific dances. You're not dancing in the mountains. Why don't you go out in nature? What is the power and the impact of staying in the city and evoking nature through choreography, through performance, and the world-building power of Butoh and, you know, Hijikata's method and the ma and the space? Can you just speak a little bit to that, of the power of that sort of conceptual approach that is in relation to ecology, and how that relates to global climate change and all these future disasters that we're having to grapple with that affect people in the cities as well?
I brought this quote back, but then I'm also going to go back to the cover of my Eco Coma book, which I think you can't see super well, but they're actually, it's a gorgeous photo. They're dancing on the old West Side Highway, which was torn down not long after this photograph was taken. It had already been closed, so this doesn't exist anymore. This is like the Hudson River Parkway. There was a highway in New York before that. And the book is called Flowers, Crack, and Concrete, right? So I'm very interested in, I'm very interested in the urban myself. And I think I remember at our Butoh Next conference in 2019, there's a Butoh dancer who often works in nature, is very, very uncomfortable in cities, and was really kind of feeling apprehensive about going to New York. And I said, you know, nature's everywhere. Nature's everywhere in New York. If you just look, there is all sorts of nature like persisting and busting through, you know. And then we were like walking around together and like, look, there's like, you know, there's plants growing on the side of that building, you know, like not ones that people planted. I mean, like there's a
Rats.
what did you say?
Rats.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
And mycelium.
Right? I mean, it's like that's the one thing that gives me like a little bit of hope is I'm like, I feel like nature is going to persist. I mean, it's getting, you know, like things get fucked up, and you know, I know you all are in drought here. Coming from Texas, I'm like, it's so great. I can feel moisture in my feet. Which I know, so we have different ideas of drought. But I think like being in a city and like and doing the work in the city, I think is really important because we think, oh, we have to go out somewhere very remote to be able to do this work. But actually, when we were in El Paso, you know, we did a workshop in there, like I think it's called Centennial Green, and it was kind of this new, you know, like center of campus, like very manicured and everything. But you know what? The creeks run underneath that, and like this is still nature, right? It's like we don't have to go somewhere else in order to do this work. We can do it where we are. Yeah.
Can I share some perspective on that?
Yeah, sure.
I'm noticing Aaron's question and your question, Yvonne, have some similarities because I wrote on my arm, I forgot my book today, The Naturalization of the Plastic Rose, right?
The naturalization
of the plastic rose that Ono was dancing with, right? So there, at least me coming from where I come from, which is an animistic background, even the imagination is the natural world. And even the ways that we transform nature to become this building, New York City, if none of the plants were, or the rats were, kind of cracking through New York City, even the historical remnants, these fossil, these like human-made, human-facilitated fossils of previous ecologies are also nature. And I think being able to, flowers cracking concrete, being able to crack the naturalization of allow the imagination to crack into nature is what I think about when I think about that question. And also Aaron's question of like, why not just do the thing? It's like because the imagination is the real thing.
Yeah. I mean, you know, like scientists who study the brain, like say, like imagining something, like the body has a physical response to it. Right?
Is sky considered nature?
Say it again.
Sky.
Sky. Oh, of course.
Yeah, right. So it surrounds everything.
Yeah. Do we need to wrap up, Yvonne?
Yeah, maybe one more question and then we'll wrap up. Any final questions? Yes.
Last question.
Last question.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, Yvonne, you can talk about this a lot, but I want to say something first, and then I'll say that. Just that I've been a guide at the Salish Japanese Garden for 15 years, and we do performances there every year. But the thing that made me think about is in the Japanese garden, for example, there's water is life is one of the themes, and there's water there, but there's these suhama. Oh, no, not suhama. Anyway, it's just a kind of stone. But the idea is that it's another way of bringing water into the garden. So somehow that image has struck me with this conversation because it's like, how can we bring more nature into where there's less of it, and we have this power to do it with just this, you know. But, so Yvonne has been part of and very interested in my Earth Zones project, which I've done in a number of countries where I come in and I work with local people, and you did the piece too, but the whole thing about that is, and I tell every time I'm working with people, I say, look, this has a history. It's moved around the world with different people. And the whole thing is how to, it's about the landscape of Earth, and the body is Earth. So it's kind of one of my little politics, I guess, is to present that, or to offer that piece as that way of saying, how can we, maybe we can't exactly erase the physicality, but how can we increase the sense of the living Earth where it is?
I mean, it's the ones in building, like it's below the concrete, it's still there. Okay.
Thank you so much.
That was my question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ashley.
Question. Okay. So I guess a lot of, like, with the quantum Butoh and the time and the space and the body, a lot of past. What of your experience of the future? Dancing the future.
That's a great question. That might be a little bit. I talk about that with when I talk about sushi. Is that sushi does a lot of work at like points of crisis, but that's also about like how do we continue? Like humans have done a lot of really horrible shit, right? And then how do you take that and have, you know, even have a future, even imagine a future. So I feel like that happens a little bit there. And of course, like my case studies are not the only things. I kind of picked ones who were doing trainings that were in nature because I'm very interested in training rather than just performance, because I think that's where we learn to do the things in the bodies, right? Yeah, I think a lot of, like Atsushi's work kind of travels across like timescapes. Yeah, I think, I mean, and again, like, you know, we saw all that amazing work last night. Some of that's very primal, ancestral. Some of that felt like very future forward, right? I feel like as a community, we just keep growing. And this is the other question, like, you know, I said earlier, like, you know, nobody's doing you know, the Japanese avant-garde visual arts. Like, okay, that was a period and now there's like retrospectives about it. But Butoh just keeps expanding, keeps going, keeps expanding. And I think it's because there's such a need for it and there's something about the form that remains adaptable. I think I credit that to, you know, to Daido Kudakan, to Maro, you know, one student, one company, and this real encouragement of like, you find your Butoh, and you do your Butoh, you find your Butoh, right? So there has also been that encouragement in our community to really find your Butoh, which gives people space to learn. Like if we were all just only learning, you know, Hijikata scores, like in, you know, in kind of the form that, I mean, because he didn't teach, he choreographed, right? I mean, it might not be as attractive to people, but I think there's something about the form that just keeps expanding. So I think that's kind of a roundabout and maybe late night answer to your question. I think it was a great one.
Thank you so much, Rosemary.